They say every town has its secrets, but this is something different, something darker. You've heard the stories, haven't you? The ones that make people lock their doors a little earlier. Some call it a tragedy lost to time, buried beneath the rubble of history. But those who were there, the ones who remember, they know it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a nightmare. I wasn't there myself, but I've heard the details from people who heard them passed down, stories shared in whispers. Nurses, orderlies, doctors who worked in the bowels of King's Park Psychiatric Center back in the early 1950s. Their accounts have trickled through the years, told to those willing to listen, including the person who eventually passed the tale on to me. The truth, they said, was far worse than anyone could imagine. They called it the week from hell. It was in 1953, and the Kings Park Psychiatric Center, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Long Island, New York. The place was filled with promise and ambition. But in the shadows, there were whispers about what was really happening inside those walls. The story starts with a man named Thomas Hale. I don't know much about him before he arrived at Kings Park. Some say he was a construction worker, others say he worked as a laborer on a nearby farm. But one thing's for sure, Thomas Hale was injured on the job, badly injured. In pain, confused, and desperate, he was sent to Kings Park, hoping to get the medical attention he needed to heal. But what they did to him there, that's what changed everything. The doctors at Kings Park were experimenting with new treatments, untested drugs that had been developed in secret. They didn't care much for the welfare of patients like Hale, people without families, without advocates, people they could use for their testing. You see, back then, they were more interested in pushing the boundaries of science than in actually curing anything. They started Hale on a new drug, something experimental. It was supposed to dull his pain, but it did something far worse. It made him hallucinate. The doctors were fully aware of the side effects, the paranoia, the violent tendencies, the breakdown of reality itself. Hale was just a number, just a body to experiment on. The more unstable he became, the more the doctors studied him. But Hale wasn't just any patient. He was a man on the edge, pushed beyond his limits. The drugs made him see things. Things that weren't there. Things that weren't human. He began hearing voices in his head, voices telling him that he was being betrayed, that the people around him wanted to hurt him. The hallucinations grew worse, more vivid. It wasn't long before Hale realized that the world he was seeing wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real. And in his twisted, drug-addled state, he knew what he had to do. One night, under the cover of darkness, Hale escaped. No one knew how he managed it. Some say he'd been planning it for weeks. Others say it was a moment of pure madness. But the truth is, when he walked out of that psychiatric center, he was no longer just a man. He was something else, something dangerous. Hale didn't stop when he got outside the gates of Kings Park. He had a purpose now, a mission. The voices in his head told him that his only chance for survival was to kill everyone who had ever wronged him. The people who had fed him those drugs, the doctors, the staff, they were all enemies in his eyes. But it wasn't just them. Over the course of 1 week, Hale would go on to murder 11 people. It wasn't random. He chose his victims carefully, with a cold precision. 3 men and 8 women. He stalked the streets, hunting them down one by one, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. The first victim was a local shopkeeper named Martin Collins. Hale found him alone in his store, a butcher knife in hand. By the time the police arrived, Collins was already dead. The second victim, a nurse named Margaret Stevens, was found in her apartment, stabbed multiple times. She'd worked at Kings Park, and Hale had likely seen her face before. She'd been one of the ones who had administered his medication. It went on like this for the next week. Hale's bloodlust, relentless. His grip on reality slipping further and further. The locals started calling it the week from hell, a time of terror when no one was safe. People locked their doors, kept their children inside, and prayed for it to end. But no one could stop him. No one knew where he was, or when he'd strike next. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Hale disappeared. The authorities searched everywhere for him. They combed the streets, the woods, even the abandoned buildings near Kings Park. But there was no sign of him, no clues, nothing. The murders were quickly buried, swept under the rug. The state and Kings Park Psychiatric Center worked hard to cover it all up. Files went missing, witness accounts were erased, and rumors were quashed. The people who had been there, who had seen what Hale had done, were silenced. They were told to forget. But some of them couldn't. Years went by, and the story faded into legend. The week from hell became nothing more than a ghost story, a tale to tell around campfires, a warning to children. But the truth still lingers in the dark corners of the old Kings Park Psychiatric Center, in the halls and rooms that are now long abandoned. People still say the files are out there, somewhere. Some claim they were lost, others say they were hidden, buried in the basement of what remains of the hospital. Some whisper that the state of New York has them locked away in a vault somewhere, hoping no one ever finds them. But I don't think we'll ever know the whole truth. What we do know is that Hale was never caught, and the bodies of those 11 victims were never properly mourned. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the empty halls of Kings Park, people say you can still hear the echoes of his footsteps. They say that if you listen closely, you might even hear the voices that drove him to murder. So next time you pass by Kings Park, or if you happen to be walking through those woods, alone and quiet, remember this story. Remember Thomas Hale, and remember the week from hell.